I think humans are no longer required in AI anymore, and it is the only bottleneck that is stopping us from progressing to the next level of AI. Why is that? Let me take you back a couple of years to when AI was initially starting out. The way AI works is there's some neural network which extrapolates information, outputs it, and there's a transformer that uses this neural network to generate tokens sequentially, and then the LLM is basically a large language model which uses these tokens and outputs them to you, right? So that is the flow of AI. When AI research was starting out, everyone believed that transformers, as soon as the paper dropped, that transformers will be the next step towards it, which is still the case, which is still why LLMs based on transformers are still mainstream. However, the way neural networks work is largely modeled after the way the human brain works, right? So, human brain has neurons. Neurons connect to each other. There's connections between two nodes or two neurons, and information travels between them, making it a wide net of sorts, which is why it's a neural network, right? The problem is artificial intelligence is modeled after human intelligence, even though it does not need to be per se. Now, from a technical perspective, I am not the person to explain this to you, but from maybe a logical perspective, I can give you a quick explainer, right? So imagine, first let's talk about the definition of intelligence, right? It's the ability to harness information and use it to inform decisions, analyze stuff. So the actual definition of intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills, right? So that is the definition of intelligence. Given that to be the case, if we allow LLMs to access information and then allow them to use that information to learn knowledge, learn skills, then that is intelligence. It does not need to be modeled after how the human brain works, but should simply be able to, one, access information, which is training data, and output analysis, output knowledge or skills, which is what LLMs do through token sequential, output. Now, given that to be the case, why is it that humans are still in the loop of AI training? That is largely because of human training data. So the reason why, and this is a question that is often brought up in non-technical discussions on AI, is why is it that AI, which is relatively young, 3 to 4 years, modeled after the human brain, able to output data at such a high reasoning level? Grok 4 is PhD level apparently. When human themselves, a human child of 3-year-old, 4-year-old, can barely put together words in the right order and make sense of it, right? So if both of them are modeled together, why is it that there's two different levels of intelligence that exist? And the quick answer to that is training data. If the child had all of the training data required and the ability to harness all of that data at will, he will or she will be 10x, 100x that of what an LLM is, simply because there's so much computing power in our brain, which LLMs don't have presently. But that is not the case. Of course, a 3 or 4-year-old child will not have that mental capacity. But still, despite never having that amount of training data, imagine the computation the brain requires to still work 10 years down the line. As soon as you hit, let's say, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, you start competing with what the LLM does with all the training data access, right? So that should give you an idea about how the human brain works computationally instead of on the basis of training data. Whereas LLMs are largely training data dependent, and thus their plateau is reached when human training data runs out, right? So as soon as new information, which is created by humans, runs out, I would guess that the LLM's ability to make new stuff possible, to understand and to analyze more patterns, drops down radically. And if that is the case, then that means that the bottleneck to AI is human training data. Now, how do we solve for that? Elon Musk recently said that we've exhaustively run out of all of the training data available by humans by training AI, and so now we're reaching the stage where training LLMs will be largely meta based. What does that mean? LLMs create data for themselves, other LLMs train on it. Now, if that is the case, why is it that this self-learning, adjudicating education policy for LLMs applies only to data? Why can't it be the case that the internal networks, the internal architecture of LLMs is such that it exceeds beyond just neural networks and identifies new networks that it can create instantly to access information, access data, and then output something, right? So the large part of that is, do humans require themselves to be a part of AI training, AI architecture by necessity, or is it something that we've chosen by design simply because that is something that made the most sense to us initially? Now, the background for this comes from a blog post by Rich Sutton, who's a comp sci teacher at University of Alberta. And he argues that every major CS development, which includes AlphaGo, which includes Deep Blue, which includes language models, and I would argue also includes quant research models, they're all built upon the inherent fact that human knowledge will never exceed what computers can identify for themselves computationally. So the example that I like to give here is, if a human expert were to compete today with the best quant research models that, let's say, Renaissance or Citadel or Jane Street has, is it a valid comparison to make? And of course it's not. Why? Because the access to one, data, and two, the access to information and architecture to process this data is far superior in computational models than it is for human researchers. Now, people who generate these models have no insight into how this model works. It's a black box where it's data in and data out. It's buy, hold, or sell at what price, right? There's no insight into how this process works. But yet, internally, we believe that the computation is so strong that this model works perfectly 99% of the time, versus compared to the the knowledgeable financial investor who focuses on fundamental analysis and still performs really, really well. But is it comparable to a hedge fund or a quant based trading firm? Of course not. So given that, is there a future possible where human intervention in AI completely stops beyond, let's say, giving prompts? So the only way to interact with an AI would then be to give prompts, and internally the architecture is completely determined on the basis of, one, the prompt, two, the access to data, and three, the architecture that the AI supposes itself to use to get to that result as quickly and as truthfully as possible. And of course, this will result in an initial decline in insight, decline in quality of insight rather, by the AI. But there's a vesting period where, let's say, 10, 15 years down the line, we'd be exponentially better off with this computational learning model versus a prediction model that outputs the next token based on training data. If that makes sense. So yeah, that's my take.